The day I made the final payment on the $80,000 debt that had suffocating my marriage for 5 years. My husband, Gideon, didn't hold me, nor did he pop a bottle of cheap champagne. He simply stared at the confirmation screen on my laptop, cleared his throat, and said, "Good, now we can finally breathe." 2 hours later, while he was in the shower, his old tablet, the one he thought was broken but that I had meticulously repaired so our daughter could use it for school, synced to his cloud storage, revealing a high-yield savings account containing nearly $95,000, registered under a joint configuration with a name I had never heard in my life, Linnea Vance. The silence that followed in our cramped, 2-bedroom rental was so heavy I could hear the rhythmic ticking of the radiator and the distant sound of water rushing through the pipes. For half a decade, I had worked 60-hour weeks at the clinic, wearing shoes with worn-down soles and skipping dental appointments, all because Gideon's failed architectural consultancy had left us on the brink of bankruptcy. I had swallowed my pride, borrowed from my aging parents, and rationed our groceries, believing we were a team fighting a storm. In reality, I was the only one drowning. When Gideon stepped out of the bathroom, a towel slung over his broad shoulders, he gave me that familiar, tired smile that I had spent years trying to comfort. "You look pale, Marlo," he said, reaching for his coffee mug. "The stress is over now. You need to learn how to let go." I kept my hands flat on the kitchen counter, feeling the cold laminate beneath my palms. I didn't scream. I didn't throw the tablet. The betrayal was too vast, too deeply rooted to be answered with noise. "Gideon," I said softly, my voice devoid of the tremor I felt inside. "Who is Linnea?" He froze, the mug halfway to his lips. It was a microscopic pause, a fraction of a second where the casual air around him shattered, but he recovered quickly. His eyes narrowed with a well-rehearsed blend of confusion and mild offense. "Linnea, she's the daughter of a former client from the firm. I told you about her years ago. Why are you bringing her up now?" "Because you share an account with her," I replied, turning the tablet toward him. The bright blue screen reflected in his glasses, illuminating the exact figure, the deposit dates matching the weeks I had pulled double shifts, and the beneficiary clause that stated the funds were exclusively for a down payment on a property in her hometown. Gideon didn't look at the screen. He looked at me, his expression hardening into that defensive, patronizing mask he used whenever I questioned our finances. "You're invading my privacy, Marlo, and you're completely misinterpreting a complex business arrangement." "Business arrangement," I repeated, the words tasting like ash. "You've spent 5 years watching me count pennies at the grocery checkout. You watched my father break open his retirement fund to lend us $10,000 when the collectors were calling every night. And all that time, you were building a nest egg with another woman." Gideon didn't flinch. He set his coffee mug down with a deliberate, controlled click. He was a master of artificial calm, the kind that makes you question your own sanity. "Linnea's father invested heavily in my consultancy before it collapsed," he said, his voice dropping into that smooth, reasonable register he used on clients. "When the firm went under, I owed them. This account isn't personal, Marlo. It's a restructured debt repayment. If I put it in my name, the bank would have seized it for the business bankruptcy. I was protecting what we owed them. By putting it in a high-yield savings account designated for a residential down payment." I pointed at the small print at the bottom of the screen. "With her name listed as a joint owner, not a creditor." He took a slow breath, looking at me with a pity that cut deeper than any insult. "You don't understand corporate law, and frankly, your paranoia is exhausting. I just told you the pressure is over. We're debt-free. Can you, for once in your life, just be grateful instead of looking for a ghost to fight?" He walked past me into the bedroom, closing the door firmly behind him. The click of the latch sounded like a gavel striking. I sat down at the kitchen table, the silence of the apartment settling back in. My daughter, Cleo, was asleep in the next room, her small breathing the only gentle thing left in my world. I looked down at my hands. The skin around my knuckles was dry and cracked from the industrial soap at the clinic. For 5 years, I had believed that love meant carrying the heaviest side of the couch. I had tied my dignity to his survival. The next morning, Gideon left for his consulting meetings early, kissing the top of Cleo's head and barely glancing at me. The moment the front door clicked shut, I called in sick to the clinic for the first time in 3 years. I didn't call a lawyer. Not yet. First, I needed to know exactly who I was dealing with. I opened the tablet again, printing out 5 years of transaction histories from the hidden account. The deposits weren't random corporate payouts. They were steady monthly transfers of $1,500, and twice a year, on dates that perfectly aligned with Gideon's solo business trips to the coast, there were large cash withdrawals. I looked up Linnea Vance online. It didn't take long to find her. She was 28, an independent interior designer based in a coastal town 3 hours away. Her social media was a gallery of airy, sunlit spaces, linen fabrics, and expensive ceramics. In one photo from last summer, she was standing on the porch of a weathered seaside cottage, laughing. In the corner of the frame, partially cut off, was a man's arm wearing a distinct, scratched silver watch. The watch I bought Gideon for our 3rd anniversary. The silver watch link was unmistakable. The scratch near the bezel was from the time Gideon had helped my father clear out an overgrown thorn bush in our backyard. A day he had spent complaining about the manual labor, while my father quietly handed him a cold beer and thanked him for being a good husband. My chest felt hollow, a sudden, cold vacuum that made it hard to draw air. I stared at the photo of Linnea on the screen. She looked serene, untouched by the kind of grinding, daily anxiety that had aged me prematurely. Her skin was glowing, her clothes effortlessly expensive. She didn't look like a mistress hiding in the shadows. She looked like a woman who believed she was the main character in a beautiful, unfolding life. A life funded by my invisible sacrifices. I didn't confront Gideon when he returned home that evening. When he walked through the door, he looked tired, dropping his briefcase by the coat rack with a heavy sigh that used to trigger an immediate wave of sympathy in me. "Rough day?" I asked, keeping my back to him as I chopped carrots for Cleo's lunch. "The usual," he mumbled, walking over to press a kiss against my temple. It felt like a physical violation, but I didn't pull away. I couldn't let him see the shift in the wind. "Just trying to rebuild the network, Marlo. It takes time. We have to be patient." "Of course," I said, my voice smooth, almost mechanical. "Take all the time you need." That night, after Gideon fell into a deep, heavy sleep beside me, I lay awake listening to his rhythmic breathing. The man next to me was a stranger, an architect who hadn't just failed a business, but had meticulously designed a double life, using my labor as the foundation. Every hour of overtime I had pulled to pay off his creditors had simply freed up his own money to deposit into the account with Linnea. He hadn't just stolen my youth and my sanity. He had stolen my father's retirement money under false pretenses. The next afternoon, while Cleo was at an after-school program, I drove to my parents' small, modest house on the outskirts of the city. The porch steps creaked as I walked up, a sound I had known since childhood. Inside, my father was sitting in his worn leather armchair, a heating pad draped over his bad knee. He smiled when he saw me, but his eyes immediately went to the dark circles under my eyes. "You're working too hard, Marlo," he said, adjusting his glasses. "The debt is gone now, right? You told us on Sunday." "It's gone, Dad," I said, sitting on the footstool near his knees. I took his weathered hand in mine. It felt small, fragile in a way that terrified me. "I want to ask you something about the $10,000 you lent Gideon 2 years ago. Do you remember the paperwork he had you sign?" My father frowned slightly, leaning back. "The promissory note? Yes, he said it was for the primary corporate liquidator. Why?" "Did he ever give you a copy of the fully executed agreement?" I asked softly. My father shook his head slowly, a faint shadow of concern crossing his face. "No, he said it was filed with the bankruptcy trustee. Marlo, what's wrong? Is something else going on?" I looked at my father's tired face, thinking of the years he spent working at the printing press, saving every dollar so I could go to college. I couldn't tell him the truth yet. It would break him, and I needed him strong for what was coming. "Nothing is wrong, Dad," I lied, forcing a reassuring smile that felt like it would crack my face. "I'm just doing some end-of-year tax planning now that we're clear. I want to make sure we pay you back exactly how we agreed." But as I drove away from their house, the tears finally came, hot and furious against my cheeks. Gideon hadn't just deceived me. He had exploited the people who loved me. I pulled over into a grocery store parking lot, took out my phone, and dialed a number I had found on Linnea Vance's public business page. I didn't call as a betrayed wife. I called as a prospective client. Vance Design Studio, her voice answered on the third ring. It was light, melodic, and entirely devoid of the strain that usually colored mine. This is Linnea. Hello, Linnea, I said, my voice steady, adopting the crisp, professional tone I used when managing difficult patients at the clinic. My name is Marlo Vance. I intentionally used my married last name, waiting to see if it triggered a reaction. There was a brief, imperceptible pause on the line, but her voice remained warm. Hello, Marlo. How can I help you today? She didn't know my name. Gideon had kept me entirely in the dark, but he had kept her in the dark about me, too. To her, I was likely just a faceless ex-wife or an old chapter he claimed to have closed. I recently purchased a small cottage on the coast, I lied smoothly, staring at my reflection in the rearview mirror. Near Oakhaven. I saw some photos of your recent work online, specifically the seaside project with the linen textures and the weathered wood. I'm looking for someone who can do a complete interior overhaul, and your style is exactly what I'm looking for. Oh, the Oakhaven cottage, Linnea said, and I could hear the immediate spark of enthusiasm in her tone. That's actually a very personal project of mine. I'd love to help you with yours. Did you want to schedule a consultation at my office, or should we meet at the property? I'd actually prefer to meet at your office first, if that's all right, I said. I'm in the city for work during the week, but I can make the drive up this Friday morning. Friday morning works perfectly. Let's say 10 o'clock. She gave me the address, an upscale creative suite in the historic district of her coastal town. When I hung up, my heart was hammering against my ribs, but the tears had stopped. The sorrow was hardening into something cold, sharp, and focused. I wasn't just going there to see her. I was going there to see the life my husband had bought for her using my father's retirement and my 60-hour work weeks. That evening, I acted normal. I made dinner, helped Cleo with her spelling words, and listened to Gideon complain about the rising cost of gas. I watched him across the living room, sitting on the sofa we'd bought secondhand, his scratched silver watch catching the lamplight as he scrolled through his phone. Gideon, I said casually, folding a basket of Cleo's laundry. I need to take Friday off. I'm feeling incredibly burnt out, and I thought maybe I'd take a day trip, just to clear my head now that the debt is gone. Gideon didn't look up from his screen. A day trip, where? Just up the coast, I said, keeping my tone light, almost careless. Maybe toward Oakhaven. I haven't seen the ocean in years. His thumb hovered over the screen. The slight stiffness in his shoulders was the only sign that the bullet had hit its mark. He turned his head slowly to look at me, forcing a relaxed smile. Oakhaven? There's really nothing out there, Marlo. Just old tourist traps and bad seafood. If you want a spa day, I can find you somewhere nice right here in the city. No, I replied, looking him dead in the eye as I tucked one of Cleo's socks into another. I think the coastal air will be good for me. I've already made plans. Gideon didn't argue further, but his silence for the rest of the evening was brittle. He paced the hallway, making a series of low-voiced phone calls on the balcony while the cold night air fogged the glass door. I didn't care what he was saying to whoever was on the other end. For the first time in 5 years, the narrative wasn't in his hands. On Friday morning, the drive up the coast was beautiful, which felt like a cruel joke. The ocean appeared on my left, a vast, slate-gray expanse beneath a pale morning sky. As the miles clicked over on the odometer, the knot in my stomach tightened, but it wasn't fear anymore. It was the sober, clear-eyed focus of a woman who had finally stopped making excuses for her own ruin. Linnea's studio was exactly what I expected. A beautifully restored brick storefront with a minimalist gold sign near the bell. Inside, the air smelled of expensive sandalwood and fresh paint. Swatches of high-end fabrics and marble samples were neatly arranged on white oak tables. It was an environment built entirely on aesthetic perfection, a stark contrast to the sterile, fluorescent-lit clinic rooms where I had spent my youth earning the money that kept Gideon's credit score alive. Marlo. I turned. Linnea was even more striking in person. She wore a tailored cream trousers suit, her blonde hair pulled back into a sleek, effortless knot. She smiled warmly, stepping forward to shake my hand. Her hand was soft, uncalloused. "Yes, hello," I said, shaking it firmly. "It's so wonderful to meet you. Come on back to my desk. I've pulled some mood boards for seaside properties based on our call," she said, gesturing toward a sunlit office at the back. As I followed her, my eyes caught a small, framed photograph on a bookshelf near her desk. It was a picture of her and Gideon, standing on the deck of a sailboat. He was laughing, his arm wrapped around her waist, wearing a pristine navy sweater I had never seen before. He looked younger, lighter, completely detached from the stressed, broke husband who came home to me every night demanding emotional labor. "You have a lovely space here," I said, my voice dangerously calm as I sat down in the leather chair opposite her desk. "It must have taken a lot of investment to build a business like this." Linnea sat down, her smile turning slightly modest, almost reverent. "Thank you. It's been a dream of mine for a decade. Honestly, I couldn't have done it without my partner. He's an architect, and he's been my silent investor and rock for the last 5 years. He always told me that when his old corporate obligations were finally settled, we'd expand the studio together." She reached for a folder, completely unaware that the corporate obligations she was talking about were my life savings and my father's retirement. "An architect," I murmured, leaning forward, my eyes locking onto hers. "That's funny. My husband is an architect too. His name is Gideon." Color didn't drain from Linnea's face all at once. Instead, her smile simply froze, a fragile piece of porcelain caught in a sudden draft. Her eyes dropped to the folder in her hands, then slowly lifted back to mine, scanning my face as the pieces of a puzzle she hadn't known she was assembling began to click into place. "Gideon," she repeated, her voice dropping an octave, losing its melodic lilt. I'm sorry, I think there must be a mistake. Gideon's last name isn't Vance, it's..." She trailed off, her fingers tightening on the edge of the cardboard folder. "It's his mother's maiden name on the account he opened with you," I said softly, leaning back in the chair. The leather creaked under my weight, the only sound in the sudden, suffocating silence of the room. "But his legal name is Gideon Vance, and the $80,000 he claimed was a corporate obligation to your father. It was the debt he built up while living under my roof, eating food paid for by my double shifts, in an apartment where our daughter sleeps." Linnea sat perfectly still, her chest rising and falling in shallow, rapid breaths. The poised, successful designer seemed to shrink inside her tailored cream suit. "No," she whispered, shaking her head. "No, that's..." He told me his marriage ended years ago. He said the divorce was just tied up in a lengthy asset liquidation from his old firm. He said he was staying in a corporate rental until the final settlement went through. "We share a bed every night, Linnea," I said, my voice entirely devoid of malice. I didn't hate her. Looking at her now, I just saw another structure Gideon had meticulously designed, built on a foundation of absolute lies. My father took $10,000 out of his retirement fund 2 years ago because Gideon told him we would be evicted. That money didn't go to a landlord. It went into your joint high-yield savings account." She blinked and a single, heavy tear escaped, tracking through her perfect makeup. She looked at the photograph on her bookshelf, the sailboat, the laughter, the navy sweater, and then looked back at me, her hands beginning to tremble. "He told me he bought that boat with the final payout from his consultancy." "He hasn't had a payout in 5 years," I said, reaching into my bag. I pulled out the printed transaction history from their shared account and laid it flat on the pristine white oak desk between us. Every single deposit matches the exact dates I received my overtime bonuses from the clinic. He was taking my salary, calling it his consulting fees, and filtering it through his mother's maiden name into this account. "For you, for your future cottage." Linnea stared at the papers. She didn't touch them, as if they were coated in something toxic. When she spoke, her voice was barely audible. "He's coming here tonight. We were supposed to look at the blueprints for the studio expansion." I watched her, a quiet, cold clarity settling deep into my bones. I stood up, smoothing the wrinkles from my worn skirt, looking down at the woman who had unknowingly lived on the spoils of my misery. "Good," I said, checking my watch, the ordinary, plastic-strapped one I wore for work. Then let's make sure everything is ready for his arrival. Linnea looked up at me, her eyes wide, glassy with a mixture of terror and dawning rage. For 5 years, she had believed she was building a life with a brilliant, self-sacrificing man who was quietly handling the remnants of a difficult past. Now, looking at the bank statements spread across her desk like forensic evidence, she was seeing the same monster I was. "What do you want to do?" she whispered, her voice cracking. "I want exactly what is owed to my family," I said, my voice steady, carrying the weight of half a decade of silent endurance. "And I think you want your dignity back." We spent the next 2 hours in that sunlit office, but we didn't look at fabric swatches or mood boards. Instead, we pulled up the digital logs of the joint account. Linnea showed me everything. Gideon had told her the $95,000 was his personal contribution to their future, a nest egg he had saved from the wreckage of his former life. Every time he had visited her on his business trips, he had used that account to fund dinners, boat rentals, and expensive weekend getaways, all while I was boiling pasta and telling Cleo we couldn't afford the field trip to the zoo. As we spoke, the dynamic between Linnea and me shifted. We weren't two women fighting over a man. We were two victims of a highly sophisticated emotional scam artist, realizing that the only way out was to dismantle his design from the inside. "He always arrives at exactly 6, Linnea said, looking at the minimalist clock on her wall. It was already 3 in the afternoon. "He parks around the corner so the local business owners don't recognize his car. He thinks he's so careful." "He is careful," I said, remembering how he handled our household bills, always hiding the granular details behind a wall of condescending financial jargon. "But he's also arrogant. He thinks he's the smartest person in every room because no one has ever forced him to show his hands." I helped Linnea draft a brief text message to him, keeping her tone exactly as it usually was. "Can't wait for tonight. I have the expansion plans laid out on the main table. See you at 6. Gideon replied within 30 seconds. "On my way down the coast now, beautiful. Can't wait to take the next step." I stared at the word beautiful on her phone screen. It was the same word he used to use for me when we were in college, before the consultancy, before the debt, back when he still looked at me like a person instead of an unpaid resource. I drove my car 2 blocks away and parked it behind a row of delivery trucks where he wouldn't spot it. Then, I walked back to Linnea's studio, entering through the rear alley door she left unlocked for me. She had set up 2 chairs in the shadowed back office, just behind the partition wall that separated her private desk from the main showroom. At exactly 5 to 6, the front bell chimed. I stood in the darkness of the back room, the smell of sandalwood suddenly making me nauseous. Through the crack in the partition, I watched my husband walk in. He looked immaculate, wearing his tailored charcoal jacket, his hair neatly brushed, and that confident, easy smile plastered across his face. In his right hand, he carried a bottle of expensive wine. On his left wrist, the silver anniversary watch caught the warm track lighting of the studio. "Linnea," he said, stretching his arms out as he walked toward her desk. "God, it feels good to finally breathe. The past is officially behind us." Linnea didn't run into his arms. She stayed seated behind her desk, her hands folded tightly over the cardboard folder, her posture so rigid she looked like a statue carved from salt. Gideon stopped a few feet away, his arms dropping slowly to his sides as the warmth in the room evaporated. "Linnea," he asked, his smile faltering, though his voice maintained that smooth, patronizing tilt. "What's wrong? You look like you've seen a ghost." "I have," Linnea said. Her voice didn't shake. It was cold, hollow, and entirely empty of the affection he was clearly used to. She slid the printed bank statements across the white oak desk. They slid with a soft friction, stopping right against the base of his wine bottle. "Tell me about these corporate obligations, Gideon." Gideon looked down at the papers. Even from the shadows behind the partition, I could see the exact second the air left his lungs. The easy, confident posture evaporated. His shoulders squared instinctively, a defensive mechanism I had seen 1,000 times at our kitchen table. "Where did you get these?" he demanded, his voice dropping into a harsh, defensive hiss. He didn't look at her. His eyes were frantically scanning the lines of text, the dates, the numbers. Linnea, I told you my finances from the old firm are incredibly volatile. This is private corporate data. Whoever gave you this is trying to sabotage our expansion. Our expansion? Linnea let out a short, bitter laugh that sounded more like a sob. With $95,000 stolen from your wife, from her father's retirement. Gideon's face flushed a deep, violent crimson. He slammed the wine bottle down on the desk with a crack that echoed off the brick walls. She's not my wife, not really. I've told you it's a legal formality we're untangling. Marlo is. She's unstable, Linnea. She's bitter because the business failed, and she's been tracking my accounts, trying to ruin my reputation. She fabricated this to drive a wedge between us. He stepped closer, reaching out to touch Linnea's shoulder. Look at me. You know me. I built this savings so we could have a life. Do you really think I'm capable of what she's accusing me of? He is, I said, stepping out from behind the partition. The sound of my voice made Gideon freeze. He didn't turn around immediately. For 3 long seconds, he stood completely still, his hand hovering inches from Linnea's shoulder, his back to me. When he finally turned, his face was pale, his eyes wide and bloodshot behind his glasses. He looked at me, then at Linnea, then back to me, the trap snapping shut around him in the quiet, sandalwood-scented room. Marlo, he whispered, his voice losing every ounce of its practiced authority. What are you doing here? I came to see the investment, I said, walking slowly into the light of the showroom. I stopped just a few feet from him, looking down at his wrist. I came to see what $80,000 of my life and $10,000 of my father's labor actually bought. Gideon wet his lips, his eyes darting toward the front door as if measuring the distance. But the door was heavy, glass, and very public. The facade he had spent 5 years maintaining was melting off his face like hot wax. Marlo, let's go home, he said, his voice dropping into a desperate, hushed tone, attempting to re-establish the dynamic where he called the shots. He took a step toward me, his hands raised in a placating gesture. You're having a manic episode. We can talk about the finances with a professional. You're embarrassing yourself in front of a stranger. She's not a stranger anymore, Gideon, Linnea said from behind the desk, her voice cutting through his attempt to gaslight me. She stood up, her knuckles white as she leaned over the white oak surface. And she's not the one who should be embarrassed. Gideon looked between us, his chest heaving. The patronizing mask was entirely gone now, replaced by the ugly, raw panic of an entitled man who realized his resources were cutting him off. You too think you're clever, he hissed, his voice dropping the polite pretense entirely. He looked at me, his eyes filled with a cold, venomous resentment. You think you did something here, Marlo? You were a clinic administrator making peanuts. Without my vision, without the lifestyle I planned for us before the crash, you'd be nothing. I took that money to rebuild, for us, for Cleo. Don't you dare bring Cleo into this, I said. The mention of our daughter didn't make me cry. It made something inside me turn to absolute stone. You didn't take that money for Cleo. You took it because you're a coward who couldn't handle the fact that you failed, and you couldn't bear to let anyone see you carry your own weight. I stepped up to the desk, right next to him. The smell of his expensive cologne, paid for by my overtime, made my stomach turn. I reached out and tapped the printed bank statements. Here is what is going to happen, I said, my voice quiet, carrying the absolute certainty of a judge delivering a sentence. Linnea has already agreed to freeze this joint account. Tomorrow morning, her attorney and my attorney are receiving copies of these exact statements, along with the promissory note you forged with my father's signature. Gideon's breath hitched. He looked at Linnea, but she met his gaze with a cold, unblinking silence. The $95,000 in this account is going to pay back my father with interest, I continued, staring into his pale, defeated face. The rest will be held in escrow for Cleo's education, and you are going to pack a single suitcase from our apartment tonight, because if you are still there by midnight, I will call the police and file a formal report for corporate fraud and identity theft using my father's name. Gideon stared at me, his mouth opening and closing slightly. He looked for a loophole, a weakness in my eyes, a shred of the compliant, exhausted wife he had manipulated for half a decade. But that woman had died the moment the tablet synced. Marlo, he stammered, a pathetic, weak attempt at a soft tone returning to his voice. "We have a family. You can't just ruin my life over this." "I'm not ruining your life, Gideon," I said, turning my back on him to look out at the darkening coastal street. "I'm just letting you live the one you actually built." Silence that followed was total. Gideon stood frozen in the center of the elegant studio, surrounded by the expensive linen swatches and marble samples he had intended to buy with my stolen life. He looked small under the warm track lighting, stripped of his architecture, his vocabulary, and his authority. He didn't fight anymore. He didn't make another speech. When a man's entire existence is a carefully structured lie, the truth doesn't just damage the walls, it collapses the foundation. Without a word, Gideon picked up his leather briefcase, leaving the expensive bottle of wine untouched on the white oak desk. He turned and walked out of the studio, the front bell chiming a light, cheerful note that felt entirely out of place as the door clicked shut behind him. Through the glass storefront, I watched his shadow disappear around the corner of the brick building, walking toward the car he had hidden so carefully. When he was gone, the tension in the room snapped like a tightly wound wire. Linnea sank back into her leather chair, covering her face with her hands. Her shoulders shook slightly, but she wasn't sobbing. She was releasing the deep, suffocating weight of a 5-year illusion. I walked over to the desk, gently picking up the folder of bank statements. "Thank you, Linnea," I said softly. She lowered her hands, her eyes red but remarkably clear. "I should thank you. You saved me from building a house on a cliff." She looked down at the empty space where Gideon had just been standing. "What will you do now?" "I'm going home to my daughter," I said. The drive back down the coast was different from the drive up. The slate-gray ocean was swallowed by the night, but the headlights of my car cut through the darkness with a steady, unshakable focus. The knot in my stomach was entirely gone, replaced by a profound, quiet stillness. I wasn't the broken, exhausted woman who had started this day. I was someone who had finally claimed her own worth. When I arrived at our apartment at 11 o'clock, the front door was unlocked. Inside, the lights were dim. A single, large suitcase stood by the coat rack in the hallway. Gideon was sitting at the kitchen table in the dark, his coat still on. He didn't look up when I walked in. He looked like an empty shell, a man who had finally realized that the wealth he thought he was accumulating was nothing compared to the absolute poverty of his character. "The papers are in the suitcase," he muttered, his voice flat, devoid of any modulation. "The account transfer authorization for your father, the quitclaim for the lease, everything." "Good," I said, not moving past the threshold of the kitchen. He stood up, rolling his suitcase toward the door. As he passed me, he stopped for a fraction of a second, his eyes resting on my face as if searching for a glimpse of the wife who used to apologize for his mistakes. But I just stood there, my hands folded, looking through him. "Goodbye, Marlowe," he whispered. "Goodbye, Gideon." The door clicked shut behind him, the sound heavy and final in the quiet hallway. I stood in the center of the small, cramped living room, listening to the rhythmic ticking of the radiator. For 5 years, that sound had felt like a countdown to financial ruin. Tonight, it sounded like peace. I walked down the short hallway to Cleo's room and opened the door quietly. The pale moonlight filtered through her window, illuminating her small face as she slept, her breathing steady and gentle. I sat on the edge of her mattress, reaching out to gently smooth a stray lock of hair from her forehead. The $80,000 was gone, spent on a ghost life that never truly belonged to anyone. My father's retirement would be returned to him by tomorrow afternoon. But as I leaned down to press a kiss against my daughter's cheek, I realized the truest asset had been recovered. I had my mind back. I had my dignity back. And for the first time in a very long time, the future belonged entirely to us.